So hi, I'm Chris Vanover, as it says on the slide. I've been in before. I've been invited back, which is great. I appreciate that very much. Tonight, I got asked to talk about how to introduce teams to Agile and cover sprint planning. Actually, go ahead and introducing teams to Agile, doing difficulty and points estimations, and doing sprint planning. Now, when this was actually proposed to me, it was in the opposite order. But the reality is that the sprint planning itself is more the culmination of all of the things that you do before it. So I flipped it so that we can discuss it that way. So the first thing that you are going to get is a resistance to change. And that's going to be for anything, whether you're introducing Agile or introducing Ice Cream Fridays or whatever it is. There's going to be some sort of anxiety over something that is not the way it's been. And so frequently the first thing that you will get, not just with Agile, but when you're trying to put any sort of process into place is, but that's how we've always done it. Or it's always been that way. And you'll find it when you're doing, even if you've got an Agile team rolling, you'll start digging into processes or have questions or, hey, why is this, why does everything have to be in this format? Oh, that's how we've always done it, right? Never take that as an answer. That's really the stuff that you should question at any time. Time will be tracked. You get this a lot from engineers. Especially when the first place that I worked that ever had a Scrum process put into place was at Microsoft. And the Microsoft engineers, especially the old Microsoft engineers, were just up in arms. It was the worst thing ever. They felt like they were going to be required to clock in and clock out, have all their hours checked, get into trouble if they weren't, proving that they had worked all the hours that they said. Turns out it's nonsense. And by the time we got to the end of the project and the producer who had come in and put the Scrum process in place had left the project, the team without her said, we want to keep doing Scrum because it had turned out to be that good. Time box creativity. This you're going to get from artists, designers, anyone who's had to do anything along those lines will, even at a just your normal day, you're not going to get to work at 9 a.m. and design until 6 and then be done designing and go home. That's just not possible, right? Creativity comes in a lot of different ways, and so one of the resistance points you're going to get is, well, you just can't measure that. It turns out you can. So these are things you should expect to hear it. Any other excuse to not change, especially if what a group is doing has already been working, there are still always ways to make it better. So you have to convince the team to try. The best way to do it is with Agile itself. You're putting a process into place, but you're going to find that every team is different, every project is different, every problem you encounter is different. And so the deal that you have to make with the team is, we'll try this. Let's give this 3 sprints. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else. And even as you start getting rolling with Agile, and even with a mature Agile team that's just still rolling along, there's always going to be something that you can take and say, all right, here's a way that we can possibly make this better. Let's try it. And that's the great thing, is that if it doesn't work, you can change it. And it's about finding what works for the team. Retrospectives. That is a topic in and of itself, but the sprint retrospective is usually the first thing that gets dropped from the process because everybody's too busy or too focused on a hectic schedule, whatever it happens to be, although that's also busy. The sprint retrospective is meant to take a look at what you've done over the last sprint figure out what worked really well and potentially what didn't. What new pitfalls the team may have encountered, or what problems are persistent, like could be anything. Tools are crashing, the team space is too noisy, our estimates were terrible. They're all things that, as a producer, it is then your responsibility to drive fixes for. The retrospective will help you get a gauge for how a team is doing, but more important, how a team is feeling. And that's really going to help you tune and fine-tune what is going on with the team. So the retrospectives themselves, after everybody's had sprint planning and sprint review and having to do everything, it's like it's another resistance point. Do we have to have the sprint retrospective, right? But the more you can do it, stick with it, and more importantly, follow through on the action items that come out of a sprint retrospective, the more the team will want to do it because they see the results. If you're just doing it and going through the motions, if you're coming up with a list of impediments and then never getting any of them out of the way, not only is the team not going to believe in the process, but they will actually start to lose faith in the producer. And that's very important. You've got to be able to follow through on those. And then the J curve is, I don't know if you can actually see, it's basically anytime you introduce something new to a team, you're going to have time and you're going to have happiness. And wherever they are, when you first introduce something, it's going to get worse. Even if you're putting in process what is going to turn out to be a successful Agile process or whatever you happen to be changing, even free ice cream Fridays, there's always going to be something going on that there's going to be anxiety, there's going to be consternation, but eventually, if you can actually stick with it, you get the J curve. That happens everywhere, and it's important to be able to stick with something long enough to actually see the results. Because I've told teams straight up, I've introduced Agile and Scrum to 4 different teams at 3 different companies, and every time it's like, here's what we're going to try. You're going to hate it. You're going to think it's the worst thing ever. Just stick with it. We'll give it 3 sprints. We'll see how it goes. And everybody's like, all right. And then you've set that expectation. Everybody knows that that's going to happen and that things will go downhill before they go up. So any questions on that so far? No? Okay. So when you're getting into now actually starting to do estimations, there's a couple of things that you're going to need beforehand. You're going to have product backlog, and the product backlog needs to have been prioritized. Now, you don't need to know everything. The whole project doesn't have to have user stories written. It helps to have as many user stories written as possible. But you have to at least be able to see what your next set of sprints looks like, your next release. You will have done potentially a story map for the major features of a product. That will generate stories, and you can start getting stories into a backlog. And a backlog is really, in and of itself, just a waterfall list of all of the things that you want to do. And the product owner is going to be prioritizing these all the time. Every time a new story comes in, it might go to the top, it might go to the bottom, it could go anywhere in between. But that's the product owner's job, is being able to make sure that all of the known work that is in the backlog has that priority, because everything that the team is going to be doing is based on that priority. Oh, the note here. So creating user stories, I know Ellen talked a little bit about this last week. Everyone should be encouraged to and expected to write user stories. Anytime something comes up, anytime somebody has a feature request, whether it's designers, artists, QA, it really doesn't matter. The important thing is that everyone should feel empowered to be writing stories, put in as many details as possible. Sometimes they can just be like placeholders, just like, you know, you think of 7 things that need to be done as you're working on something, then you can just create stories for those. You can come back and fill them out later. But it makes sure that things don't fall through the cracks, and it gives more things for the product owner to think about. Now, they may take some of those stories and say, this is a great suggestion, we'll, you know, put that in a post-release environment, but everyone should be writing stories. Now, when you get to estimation, what it should be. The one thing that you will always want is a baseline story to start. If you've got a team that's never estimated anything before, then what you will do is take a story that there's general agreement is kind of medium-sized. It's a very vague definition. If you've been doing work, then you can kind of do it in hindsight and say, oh, this, you know, took us a little while, right? And it wasn't trivial, it wasn't, you know, horrible. And you want that baseline. And then literally all you do is compare every other story to it. And you can say it's bigger, it's smaller, it's the same. And then as you get 3 categories, you can then start broadening those. This is really big, this is trivial. And you can start actually sorting, because really estimation is just coming up with, is just putting them into buckets. It's not time, and I know Ellen actually had a chart last week that said, here's how points kind of equate to time. Did she? Excellent, that is great to hear. So that's the biggest trap, is no matter how good a team is at estimating, everyone wants to fall into the trap of how many points equals how many days, or how many hours, or whatever it happens to be. But it's really not. It's always going to be relative size. And the biggest problems is that, well, and I'll get to this later, but everybody's definition of size is different. Team to team, person to person. 5 points on one team isn't going to be 5 points on another. I've worked on teams where a sprint was 80 to 90 points, and I've worked on teams where with the same number of people, sprints were 30. But they were still doing full sprints worth of work. It's just how they as a team estimated everything as big, small, and everything in between. Tasks, which I will get to, is where you allocate your time. And doing estimation should be done, I put it comfortably quick. Basically what you want to do in any estimation meeting, you know, a good pace is that once a week you'll have a meeting and you'll get together and you'll estimate. And what you want to try to do is make sure that when you get to your sprint planning, you've got enough stories estimated for a couple of sprints worth of work, 2 or 3 sprints. You never want to try to estimate the entire backlog, because by the time you get there, how you measure will be different. That will evolve over time. You'll quickly find yourself having to re-estimate stories. And I've seen teams sit down and estimate the entire backlog, and it's sometimes a 2-day affair where they'll spend 8 hours a day sitting in a room trying to make sure that everything's estimated so they have an exact number that they can say equals this and figure out when they're going to ship. BS. Don't do it. Don't ever try it. You need to be able to, you can estimate, also for another talk, you can estimate a project based on a handful of sprints worth of work and a handful of sprints worth of estimation. Okay. Thanks. So, as I was saying, every team is different. Definitions of big and small are different. The tolerance for large stories is different. Just like teams will say sizes are different. Some teams will say, you know, I had one team where a 20-point story meant that this was going to be all this one person did for an entire sprint, right? They were going to take on a 20-point story. They weren't going to touch anything else. I had another team where an 8-point story was too big and needed to be split into smaller stories. And it's up to the individual team. As you're doing estimations, as soon as a team starts balking or starts arguing over what's in a story or what the sizes are, that's an indication that the story's too big and should be split if possible, or that the story doesn't have enough details and you should skip it. And, you know, rework it, estimate it during the next meeting. And the meeting length. You should never want to go more than an hour, but sometimes you'll notice either the team, you will say, oh yeah, we can keep going a little more, that's great, or everybody's eyes will start to glaze over and everybody's holding up their poker cards and right? And at that point, call the meeting. Call the meeting, it's done. You can schedule, if you've got a lot to get through and you didn't get through a lot in the meeting, schedule another meeting for another day, because it's easier to just do a series of 45 minute to an hour meetings than it is to try to get everybody to do it all at once. You'll just lose the group at that point. Oh, it switched. Okay, so planning poker. Ellen covered planning poker a little bit last time. Basically, you're going to have everybody with their cards. You'll want to review the story. Everybody will make their estimates. The one thing that's important is whoever threw the highest and lowest number then need to speak up and tell you why. You'll find that you know, some people may have just guessed wrong when, you know, everybody throws a 5 and there's a 3 and a 13. All right, the 13 could either have perfectly valid reasons, oh guys, we forgot about this, or it's like, no, you guys are right, never mind. But it's important still to make sure that those voices are heard. Why do you think it's the smallest? It's smaller than everybody else did. Why do you think it's larger? And then what you'll do is everybody will repick new numbers and come out again and see what they say. What you want to do is get everybody adjacent. So if everybody's 3s and 5s, great, it's a 5. If everybody's 5s and 8s, it's an 8. You generally want to go with the bigger side because it's a lot easier to compensate for overestimating than underestimating. You'll see teams that you know, will get to a sprint retrospective, or they'll come to you halfway through the sprint and say, oh my God, you guys, I know we made this a 2-point story, but it's more like an 8. We really blew this guess. But if it happens to go the other way around and you have an 8-point story that was a 2, fine, great. You know better for next time. But it's a lot easier for somebody to then get that story out of the way and start on something new than it is for someone to have expected to do a lot of stories and then get bogged down with a really big one. So if you get everybody to 2 adjacent numbers, at least until you really learn how the team works, put in the bigger number and just go on to the next one. If after a couple of rounds there's still no agreement, it could be another indication that there's not enough information in the story, and it'd be another example of set it aside, revisit the story at a future meeting. Any questions on that? Okay. So the process is going to evolve. Estimation accuracy is going to improve over time. It's one of the reasons why you never want to estimate the entire backlog in one go. Question? No? Okay. it's as the team evolves, you can abandon the poker cards. Everybody will just start, they'll start using just their hands and spitting out numbers, and it goes a lot faster, and people start doing like rock paper scissors and throwing their estimates, and you'll also start getting less discovered work during the sprint. Now, discovered work is any team's danger. It's always going to happen. You want to try to minimize it as much as possible. Discovered work could be, somebody's working on a story and discovers that, there's a dependency with another team, or somebody realizes that now that we're actually building this story, an entirely new body of work is going to be necessary to support it. And things like that are always going to come up, always, always, always. The ways to, you need to be able to plan for that, which I think I may have next. Yes, okay. So, the estimation itself is, like I said, it will evolve. Teams get better. They start knowing what works and doesn't. They start knowing who's on the team and who isn't, what skills people have. A lot of times a story will come in where people will kind of defer to one or two people who have more expertise with what the story is asking for. Particularly when you have, like art or design as part of the team, which you should, and a story comes through that's very tech heavy, very engineering heavy. A lot of time the artist will just go, 3 maybe, and it really, and they'll start to learn also what the team is doing, and then eventually they'll be going, oh yeah, isn't this, didn't you have this as a 3 last time? And then that starts to work and build momentum with the team. The whole thing is, no, go back. So when you actually get to sprint planning, this should actually be the easiest part of the entire process. As the producer, you will need to know 2 things. One is the capacity of the team, which the first time you do it, you're just not going to know. You can kind of, especially if the team's already been working and you're bringing this to the team, you can see, how much they can kind of do in whatever you're defining as a sprint. Say it's 2 weeks. You'll know about how much work they've already done, and they can pull work that feels like that amount, right? And try it and see what happens. They may blow through it that sprint, or they may not. They may get through half of it, but then that gives you your baseline. Now you know generally what their capacity in points would be, and you can actually start tracking that, and you can see the increase over time as they go sprint to sprint to sprint. So the capacity is going to be your knowledge of the team and how much work they do. Contingency is how much of the sprint you set aside for disasters. And it doesn't necessarily have to be disasters. It could just be anything that comes up. Another team comes in and steals one of your engineers for 2 days. It really could be anything. But generally what you try to do, I've seen teams that have had as much as 50% contingency because there's a lot of things external to the project that they're working on. But ideally you should be going for kind of a 15 to 20%, and that's of available hours. I know Ellen has said it too, but it's very important, especially in a normal workday, is to only plan for 6-hour days. That gets you all of your meetings, that gets you all of your stand-ups, that gets you lunch, that gets you people kind of coming in and kind of strolling out. But you can generally rely upon 6 or so hours of work per person per day. And then the other thing to do is also, like in a 2-week sprint, you wouldn't plan 10 work days, you would plan 9. Because you're going to have sprint planning, sprint review, you're going to do a retrospective, you're going to lose 1 day total to being able to do all of those things. And so 2-week sprint, you're looking at a 54-hour workload per person, and so you wouldn't want somebody spending